When I first moved from Australia to this rural American town, I heard stories, rumors of a cabin deep in the woods, where no sane person would tread. They called it the Devil's Bunker. People said it was a place of cults, blood rites, and worse. But I was young, foolish, and restless. Alone in a town where everyone knew everyone else's secrets but mine, I thought searching for the cabin would give me a sense of thrill, an escape from the monotony. Months went by, and I found nothing. But I refused to give up. My boots crunched the dry leaves every weekend as I trudged through the thick forest. But the woods twisted in on themselves, forming a labyrinth that spat me out every time. Back to familiar roads, to the bland world of cracked pavements and old gossip. Until one evening, when I found it. The cabin was half buried in the underbrush, like it had been pulled down into the earth by roots too thick and sinister to be natural. Gray, rotting wood sagged against the frame. I remember thinking that the cabin itself looked like it was gasping for air. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I stepped in. The stench hit me first, like a slap in the face, a mix of rot, decay, and something acidic that burned my nostrils. Cockroaches skittered across the floors, spiders clung to webs hanging like curtains, and thick dark centipedes swarmed the cracked walls. Then I saw the symbols. The walls were covered in carvings and paintings, blood-red eyes that seemed to follow my every move, and upside-down crosses that looked like they were vibrating with some unseen force. Worst of all were the bodies, naked, twisted corpses that dangled from the rafters like grotesque puppets, their eyes all gouged out. I backed away in horror, my foot crunching on shattered glass. That's when I ran. I couldn't be sure how long I ran before I burst through the door of my friend Ryan's house. My breath came in ragged gasps as I told him what I'd seen. Ryan didn't believe me, of course. Thought it was a prank, or an overactive imagination. But my shaking hands and wild eyes must have convinced him to humor me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take him back. It took hours to retrace my path, the sun already low when we found the cabin again. Ryan smirked as we pushed open the door, and I braced myself for the smell, but it was gone. The bodies were gone too, the walls wiped clean of symbols. Just an old abandoned ruin, it seemed. "See?" Ryan said. "Nothing but some homeless guy's hangout." Still, something kept me on edge. A crawling sensation at the back of my neck. My nerves felt raw, but Ryan went in further, checking each room, calling out for me to follow. I should have run. But as much as my mind screamed at me to leave, my legs carried me deeper into that place. I don't know why. We reached the last room, and that's when we heard it. A soft rustling, like dry leaves. We turned around and there it was, the figure standing in the doorway, its back to the dimming sun. Tall, too tall, and so thin that it looked like a black thread about to snap. It wore a long coat, dark like tar, and its face was a pale mask with hollow eyes that gleamed like wet coal. The knife it held was curved and silver, reflecting just enough light to burn its shape into my memory forever. It didn't speak, didn't lunge. It just watched us, watched as if waiting for something. Ryan's bravado drained from his face, his mouth hanging open like a broken hinge. I tried to force open a window, but it wouldn't budge. Ryan grabbed a piece of wood, attempting to break the glass, but the pane didn't even crack. And still, the figure stood there, unmoving. It felt like hours, though it could have only been minutes. Ryan and I were shaking, but the figure only stood there, knife in hand. Then, without warning, it did something I didn't expect. It put the knife away. The silver blade disappeared into the folds of its coat, swallowed by darkness. With slow, deliberate movements, it stepped aside, out of the doorway. It wanted us to leave. We didn't wait to ask why. Ryan and I bolted, pushing past the threshold and sprinting through the woods. The branches clawed at our faces, The roots tried to trip us, but we didn't stop. Not until we were back on familiar asphalt, our breaths burning in our lungs, our hearts hammering like drums. We told our parents, who didn't believe a word of it. The police came the next day, did their investigation, and told us there was no cabin, that we must have stumbled upon an abandoned shack used by squatters. They laughed off our terror and grounded us for causing a scene. They said any rumors of a cult were just local legends, stories to keep kids like us from getting into trouble in the woods. But that night, as I lay in bed, my fingers pressed against my ears to block out every little sound, I saw them again. The symbols, the upside-down crosses, the blood-red eyes, and then the tall figure, staring. Only this time, I could see the eyes beneath that pale mask, and I swear, they glinted with recognition, the way someone looks at an old friend. Weeks went by. The nightmares lessened. Ryan and I tried to joke about the cabin, convince ourselves that it was just a bad prank. But one night, the whispers began. It was faint at first, like wind rustling through the trees, but as the nights dragged on, I could make out words. My name, over and over, coming from the woods. One night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked to the edge of the forest, my hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" I screamed into the darkness. And then, in the silence that followed, I saw it, the faint outline of the tall figure just beyond the trees watching. But this time, it didn't block my path. Instead, it raised a hand and beckoned, the long fingers curling toward me like hooks. I turned and ran, but my feet felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to drag me back. And as I ran, I heard the whisper again, curling around my thoughts like smoke. "You found the cabin? But you were never meant to leave. I don't know what it wants, but I can feel its eyes on me every night." The whispers grow louder, more insistent, and I know one day soon, I won't be able to resist the call. The cabin found me once, and I know it will find me again. And this time, I don't think it will let me go. I was 6 years old when it happened. My aunt was babysitting me for the day and took me to the mall. It was one of those small-town malls, the kind that you could wander through in an hour and see everything. We sat in the food court, my sneakers dangling above the tiled floor, kicking rhythmically against the metal chair as my aunt picked at her salad. I remember the overhead lights, bright and sterile, turning everything a pale, washed-out white. "I need to use the restroom," she said suddenly, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Stay right here. I'll be back in a few minutes." She smiled, and I nodded like a good kid, feeling the mild panic of being alone in such a big place, but trusting her to return quickly. It didn't even occur to me to disobey. When she walked away, I played with my toy truck, steering it across the table's surface and pretending it was on some great adventure. That's when he appeared. A man in his 30s, or maybe older. I couldn't really tell back then. He looked ordinary in the way that strangers in crowds always do, with nothing particularly memorable about him. But he moved quietly, like a shadow, and it wasn't until he spoke that I realized he was standing right beside me. "Hey there," he said, his voice soft, soothing. "Where's your mom and dad? Are you lost?" I wasn't afraid. Why would I be? He smiled as he spoke, like adults often did when talking to kids, so I answered honestly, not thinking twice. "My aunt's in the bathroom." He nodded thoughtfully, his smile never wavering, but his eyes were fixed on me like he was studying me, measuring me. "How about we hang out for a bit while you wait? It'll be fun." He held out his hand to me, palm up, as if inviting me into a game. And, being 6 years old, I took it. The second his fingers closed around mine, a strange feeling washed over me. His grip was firm, too firm, and the skin of his hand was cold and dry like paper. It was only later that I would remember the way his eyes glinted, almost hungry. At that moment, I was just a kid holding hands with a grown-up, trusting without reason. my little heart speeding up at the thrill of meeting someone new. But then, everything shifted. A sound, like running footsteps, reached us just as he began to lead me away. I turned to see my aunt rushing toward us, her face pale and tight with fear. The man's smile faltered, and for a split second, I saw something in his expression I didn't understand then. Terror. He let go of my hand so quickly that it hurt, and then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd like he'd never existed at all. My aunt grabbed me, hugging me so tight I thought my ribs would crack, and I could feel her heart pounding against mine. She looked around frantically, but the man was already lost in the sea of people. She told me never to talk to strangers, and we left the mall that day without buying a thing. But that wasn't the end of it. I grew up, and the memory of that day blurred over time. For a while, I couldn't even remember the man's face. But as I got older, little details would come back to me in flashes. His crooked smile, his hand, so cold and dry, the way his eyes almost glowed under those sterile lights. Every time I thought of him, a chill prickled across my skin. Years passed, and I went back to that same mall often, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. It was almost like I was drawn to it, always looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him in the crowd. But he never came. Then, last month, something changed. I was walking through the food court, and for the first time in years, I felt it again, that prickling chill, like eyes on my back. I scanned the faces around me, mothers with strollers, teenagers glued to their phones, old couples sipping coffee, ordinary people. And then I saw him. He was sitting at one of the tables, alone, with an untouched tray of food in front of him. His hair was gray now, his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking those eyes. The moment he saw me looking, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a wave of ice down my spine. My instinct was to run, to bolt out of the mall and never come back, but I couldn't move. I could only stand there, rooted to the spot, staring as he raised his hand and waved. And that's when I noticed something horrifying. His hand was still the same, pale, dry, with long, thin fingers. They hadn't aged a day. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of the trance. When I looked back up, he was gone. I couldn't find him anywhere, no matter how hard I searched. For weeks I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that it wasn't him. But at night, as I lay in bed, I would hear faint footsteps outside my window, just soft enough to make me doubt my sanity. I'd check the locks twice, then 3 times, but still I felt him nearby, just beyond the glass, watching. And then, last night, I woke to a sound that froze my blood, soft tapping against my bedroom window. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw his silhouette framed in the moonlight. Just the outline of him, but those fingers. They tapped in a rhythm, like they were knocking on the glass. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. I didn't dare to move. I lay there staring, until morning light washed away the shadow and the tapping stopped. But when I finally got the courage to get out of bed and look outside, the only trace of him left was a single handprint on the window pane, pale, dry, and hauntingly familiar. I don't know how, but he remembered me, and somehow he found me. I called the police soon after. When they came, they found a shoe print right below my window, right where he was standing. I didn't know what to think, but I knew then I had to move out. The police told me they really couldn't do anything, but if I ever saw him again, I could call them. That wasn't enough. Within a month, I moved out of that small town. I live in a big city now. But the fear has never gone away. I still wonder how he knew it was me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just followed a girl back home. Either way, I will never forget that night or that man's face again. I hope we never meet again. I was 15, and Snapchat had become a place of discovery. It was a world where the flick of a finger could make someone a friend, a confidant, or, in the case of Raul, something far more complicated. He found me one day, among the thousands of profiles that flooded the app, and he started with a simple, casual message: "You look beautiful." At 15, the weight of those words sank deep. Compliments from a stranger felt like secrets whispered just for me. I responded eagerly, and Raul replied with even more praise. He told me he liked the way my hair fell across my face, the color of my eyes. It was intoxicating. Within days, we were chatting constantly, sending pictures and videos. It felt like Raul lived in my phone. Every time it buzzed, it was him. He was handsome in his photos, taller than me by a head, with dark eyes that seemed to see right through the screen. He was always online, always wanting to talk, and it wasn't long before he said it. "I love you." And in my teenage heart, I felt like I loved him too. But then the questions began. The curiosity that seemed so sweet started to feel more like pressure. "Where do you live? Are you alone right now? Your parents go out of town a lot, don't they?" When I didn't respond quickly enough, the messages piled up, faster and more desperate. "Where are you? What are you doing?" It felt like he was constantly watching me, waiting for my next move. The suffocation built until I couldn't bear it any longer. So I started ignoring him, missing his calls, replying to his messages later and later. Slowly, I put distance between us, hoping he would just fade away. It was late one Friday night when everything changed. My parents were out of town again, and I was curled up on the couch, some rerun playing on TV. I didn't think much of it when I heard the first knock, a soft, rhythmic tap against the window behind me. The curtains were open, but it was dark outside, and the reflection in the glass only showed my own face, pale and wide-eyed. My heart quickened, and I sat there, paralyzed, telling myself it was just the wind, or an animal. But the tapping came again, this time on the front door. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, and I saw his name flash on the screen. Raul. The message chilled me to my core. I'm outside. Open the door. How did he find me? I hadn't told him where I lived. My hands shook so badly I could barely type. "Raul, I don't feel ready to meet in person. You need to go," he called. I hesitated, but then answered, my voice a scared whisper. "Please, just leave. I didn't tell you to come here." His voice was different from how it sounded in my head. It was low and calm, almost soothing, like he was talking to a child. "I drove all this way just to see you," he said. "I'm not leaving until you open the door." I stood up, my legs weak, and I could hear the floorboards creak under my weight as I edged toward the door. And then I saw him, his tall silhouette framed against the porch light, just like in his photos, but off. He was standing too close to the door, his eyes scanning the window for movement. The realization hit me like ice. He'd been watching me through Snapchat, using the app's location feature to find me, to track me. "Open the door," he repeated, his tone soft, but with an edge that felt like a threat. "Go away," I said through the door, trying to sound strong, but my voice came out as little more than a squeak. His smile never faltered as he leaned in, pressing his forehead against the door as if to see me better. "You don't understand, do you?" he whispered. "I know everything about you now. Where you live, where you sleep, and how long you've been home alone." It felt like the walls were closing in. I was trapped, pinned by his words. But in that terrible moment, my phone buzzed again. New message from Raul. "I've been watching you for 2 days now. You shouldn't leave your curtains open." The room started spinning. My fingers hovered over the lock of the door, trembling, torn between opening it to make him go away or running upstairs to hide. Just then, something broke through my panic. A familiar voice. The voice of my dad, shouting my name as his car pulled into the driveway. I hadn't heard him arrive. Raoul's eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw panic there, like a mask finally falling away to show the true face underneath. He muttered something, a curse or a plea. I couldn't tell which, then turned and bolted into the night. I threw open the door as my dad came running up the steps, and I crashed into him, sobbing into his chest. He held me, asking what had happened, his voice frantic, but all I could do was point into the darkness where Raoul had disappeared. The police came, and I told them everything. The texts, the calls, the knocking at the window. But Raoul was gone, and no one ever found him. It's been years since that night, but I still check the locks 3 times before going to bed. Every now and then, I'll hear a tapping sound against my window or door, and I'm thrown back to that moment. The silhouette against the porch light, the sound of his voice whispering through the door. I deleted Snapchat long ago, but I can still hear the notification ping in my nightmares. And sometimes, I'll dream that I open the door, that Raoul steps into my house with that same crooked smile, a knife glinting in his hand as he tells me how long he's waited. I'll wake up sweating, the terror gripping me like a vice, and for the rest of the night, I'll sit by the window, watching for movement in the darkness, waiting for the shadow of someone who knows too much and was never meant to find me.